Hi, I'm Marco Ottewitte, founder of ManMatter, and I'm here today with Daniel Beutler, ex-CEO of Trainline International and now executive coach and board member at various companies, I think. Hi, Daniel.
Hi, Marco. Good to see you again.
Yeah, very nice to see you again. We just said so. We did this last time a few years ago during COVID still,
Yeah,
so now it's still remote, but it's
but
nicer
at least you
overall.
can go out again. Yeah, that's quite
Exactly,
nice.
exactly. So, can you introduce yourself and give us a bit of background, in particular regarding the history and travel and all of the things you've done and will be doing there in the future?
Absolutely, my pleasure. Well, look, I'm really a transportation guy, right? So I studied transportation. I started briefly with Lufthansa, then worked with Deutsche Bahn. My ranks up into the CEO of Western Europe for the sales department, and then joined Captain Train, a very small startup. So changed from a 350,000 people company to I think 20 at times. And then we raised a B series, grew to 150 people, and then were acquired by Trainline. And when I left in 2020, beginning of 2020, we were roughly 800 and IPO'd before. And in the end, I was the president of Trainline International, as you said. And ever since, I'm doing executive coaching. So I'm accompanying CEOs who pretty much do the same journey. So come from a startup to scale up world and realize at one point that the founders or what they used to know as founders is not always working the same way once you sit in front of 100 people, for example. And obviously there come a lot of tech challenges with it. So that's really fun. And as a side gig, almost spending as much time, obviously, I'm chairman of Rail Europe and Trans Report. Trans Report, they are looking into everything that is reduced mobility. Yeah. So elderly people, but obviously also people with disabilities. So quite interesting, and it's a good combination of joining companies and people for 6 months, for a coaching gig, but also accompanying them for longer as a chairman. Yeah.
And like I said, sort of you've seen quite a diverse set of companies, right? Like DB, huge, and then Captain Train, a small stage, and then Trainline International, sort of scale up stage with like 800 people and so on. Sort of based on that broad perspective, sort of. What do you think are sort of the biggest challenges for companies in travel, sort of for established companies, but also maybe for startups, sort of that want to get a hold in the market?
Yeah, so I think there's a combination of things. First of all, we have to accept that we're entirely globally, and travel never knew borders, really. I think rail, to some extent, knew borders and still no borders in terms of some legacy tech, but the rest of the industry doesn't know borders, and therefore we have to compete with the world. And not only, let's say, with other European markets. And that obviously is a challenge because, companies in China, companies in the Middle East are working differently, sometimes also subsidized, but most importantly, they spend money very differently. Whereas we in Europe, we have a tendency to go into project mode. They just spend. And it's also a question of reputation sometimes, quite interestingly. So whereas we are driven a lot by costs, a lot by, let's say, ROI neutral or neutrality within a year or so. Yeah, so we want everything, to be profitable within quite short time. The other countries really invest in much longer. I think we need to watch out that we're not being overtaken on every end.
Yeah, that makes sense. Although I guess it's now sort of a bit different where money is much more expensive than like a few years ago, where sort of it was much easier sort of to sort of get support by your investors sort of for longer while not being profitable, right?
Yeah, no, that's true. On the other hand, I see because there is not a lot of companies that you can actually invest in these days. So I do see that investors, especially private equity, is quite keen on providing the right support for the companies they need because they will understand that probably they won't be acquired tomorrow. And in order to have a longer run, definitely you need to look at cost, but you also need to give them a shot at being successful in the first place. So it's a combination of all of them, actually.
Yeah. And I think that also relates to something I read recently. I think on FocusWire, so where sort of somebody said sort of now is the leapfrog moment for the travel industry, sort of coming from sort of a lot of like legacy in terms of tech, in terms of product, in terms of ways of working and so on, right? And companies that are like at the front of sort of that leapfrog ahead and sort of the movement into the future, they will be the ones that will be winning long term, probably.
I agree.
That just requires a bunch of investment, obviously.
Yeah. Yeah, and we have also some other quite interesting trends. If you take a look at rail, for example, it's the renaissance of rail. Everybody wants to take rail. It has become a complete hype. I remember on Trainline 10 years ago, it's not that we were having trouble to find people, but people didn't join because rail was sexy. It was because Trainline as a brand and Captain Train especially were very sexy. So people wanted to work with the brand, not because they wanted to work in the industry. Today, actually, people join these companies because they want to work in rail and make a change. So it is completely different. But however, it's one of the most complicated markets to work in now. And if I look into the fact that we have 1.3 billion handicapped people or disabled people in the world, it is definitely not a niche. But still, as a society, we take the luxury to completely ignore them. And these are things that you can solve either from the infrastructure side or from the tech side, as always. In supporting them and giving them the right way of, reserving, getting the support that they need. And when we talk about 100 million people in Europe alone being older than 65, then this is a group of people that very soon won't be able to move very easily anymore without change in infrastructure and on the tech side. So it's not, we cannot allow the luxury to ignore these groups of people anymore.
Yeah, for sure. And that directly sort of brings us to my next question, which is about sort of where do you see sort of potential for the future? So I guess sort of this is certainly an area where you see a lot of potential, right?
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of potential lies in making sure that it's much easier to access. So I think, well, definitely competition is an important factor. But a former CEO of SNCF, of the French Railway, said something really nice. He said, competition is going to be won over sales, basically. So if you don't have access to the train, to the new train, for example, which doesn't have a brand or anything, then you won't win it. And in the end, it's a question of tech. So it's a question of how much tech and how much data do you have in your inventory to actually make your train sellable, more or less. And therefore, this is extremely important. So I really believe that competition and having a fair shot at competition is a question of tech in the end.
Yeah. So you mean sort of in terms of sort of like being connected to the wider travel industry?
Yeah, exactly. Let's imagine you come up with a new train. Let's say you run a line, I don't know, Paris-Frankfurt in competition to Deutsche Bahn and SNCF. Nobody knows your brand. Nobody would know that you even run on that line. And even if you do a lot of marketing until people realize that you have a certain brand, you have your own website, etc., you're already dead because you cannot allow to invest for 2 years operating a train. And therefore, you need to have a great experience. And like you said, most of the people probably won't start in Frankfurt or Paris. They will start in, let's say, Nantes or Fulda. And therefore, they need to have access from their destination to their destination and from their point of origin, OD. And and therefore you need access to wider system, but it's not that easy, as you know. You need to connect it. You need to make sure that data actually is corresponding to your system, etc. And that requires a lot of extra work. And therefore, I think the best legislation actually just opens system and makes them accessible and forces others to put your data into their system and the other way around. And therefore you need to create standards, which is definitely not the case in the rail industry, but even in many other industries, it's not the case.
Exactly. But I mean, in rail, there's one standard coming, which is OSDM, right? I think it's going to take some time, but I mean, that will also make it easier for small carriers like the ones that you're describing, right? If they have an OSDM compliant API, it's going to be much easier to integrate with existing
Let's say a little bit easier. A little bit easier.
Yeah, that's true for sure. I mean, speaking of sort of like integration with other carriers and distribution channels and so on, sort of that leads immediately to legacy. Right? There's like a lot of legacy in the market, right? There's legacy in GDSs, and there's a lot of legacy in terms of like products and user experience. We did a bunch of did a bunch of like high level assessments of sort of some of the biggest tour operators in Germany, sort of websites, right? And I mean, in some cases that feels a bit like a trip into the 90s or so, right? Because it's so outdated
Make it
visually and also
60s or 70s, huh?
or maybe that even, yeah, because it's so outdated, sort of like visually, but also technically. So it's slow, and sort of you get shown offers that are not actually available, but sort of they don't know until you book, right? So they show them anyway. I think sort of that puts a lot of pressure on, in particular, on established companies, right? Sort of that like can't easily move away from that legacy. What is your perspective on that, and where do you see the biggest challenges for established companies sort of to modernize so they're better able to compete with like new challenges like Captain Train was back in the day?
Well, you said it is hard for them to move away. In the end, it's a question of money. It's a question of investment. And if you take Austrian Railways, for example, they did what we call tabula rasa, right? They said from one day to the other, we're going to start from zero, and we're going to set up a new platform with new front ends, and it worked really well. And ever since, they are set up for the future. Whereas Deutsche Bahn, for example, I won't compare the two of them, right? Because Deutsche Bahn is much more complex and obviously in the heart of Europe and therefore connected to so many neighboring countries. But Deutsche Bahn made a call and said, we're going to do patch after patch until they decided to start their new system, which is still not up running entirely. And in the end, I'm not sure if you draw a line, it's probably more costly to do it this way than just saying, we're going to stop it for a while, like they do in infrastructure now, right? If you now take a look at the big projects where they close the entire line, it's the same thing. Now they have tried to patch it all around, but why is that? Because the key shareholder and the only shareholder, which is the state of Germany, decided they want them to be, let's say, a tendency to profitability. They're not profitable at all. But you can say either you lose, 5 billion for 3 years, or you lose 3 billion for 10 years. But every year, and every government can say, well, look, we reduced that a bit, instead of saying, we're going to reinvest once and for all, make it proper, and then kind of start from zero. So I wouldn't echo what you said in the sense it's impossible or it's hard. It's really a question of investment.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I mean by hard, I guess. Right?
No, definitely, it's not an easy call to make. As always. I mean, it's an industry that is 200 years old, and in sales, we're sometimes talking about systems that are not exaggerating from the 50s or 60s. So. And that's where we are, and that's what we have to deal with. But good for you guys, I guess. A lot of work to support with.
I mean, there's lots to do for sure. Yeah. I think there's stuff to do sort of on two sides. So at the level that we work at, sort of working with the with the delivery teams, with the technical teams, with the product people, and so on. Right. I think there is work sort of at the level of sort of replacing old systems and building better products with better user experience, better integration, like, for example, new payment methods, and I want to have my train ticket in my Apple wallet and whatever, right? All of those things that people expect now. So that's the one side. And I think the other side is sort of enabling teams and supporting teams to just be more agile, be more flexible, be faster, like faster decision-making, more like ownership in the delivery team, so they have stronger motivation, they have like more ability to sort of decide things themselves and so on, right? So I think in a way, sort of as a big company, as an established company, you need to sort of go back and get more like a startup again, right? And I think that's kind of what you're describing in your book that you can tell the viewers about, sort of where you describe sort of how you get from being a startup to scale up and then IPO or whatever. I think for established companies, sort of in travel in particular, you need to do that in reverse, right? Sort of you need to go from sort of being big and relatively static and slow moving and so on to like be more like a startup again, right?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think it's very, very tough to have a kind of that innovation from within of a big company. Sometimes it works that you have intrapreneurs, startups in the own company. But basically, I don't know, you have to found them outside of your own company and then try to get them in-house. But often even the greatest innovation is killed once you include them in a big corporate. I think the biggest difference, let's be completely honest, is in big corporates, it's about making careers. It's not so much about solving actual problems for the cause of the problem. It's you solve it to show it off so that you can make your next career move. Whereas in startups, people actually care about what they provide to, as a product to the society or whatever it is. And I think that's really almost a clash of interest behind it. Yeah. And I'm exaggerating a bit. I'm not saying that nobody cares within the big companies, but I'm saying that's kind of on top management often the case, obviously. Yeah. And therefore it is so important what you guys are doing, because you need help to innovate, to be agile, to work in a different style. Yeah. I always find it interesting. When I worked in the headquarters of DB, everybody was dressed up. Yeah? I worked in a suit and a tie for my entire corporate life there. If you go there today, everybody wears white sneakers and they're sitting in lounges. But did anything change on the culture? No, not at all. Yeah, so it's not that they are not trying. It's not that they are not trying to become less corporate, but actually nothing really changed.
Yeah, it just looks different now, right?
It looks different, absolutely. And like I said, I'm not saying that they are not trying, but it is almost impossible with the same people to move in a completely different direction. And therefore, either you get support, just like from yourselves, but I think it is much easier for a start/scale up to do so than it is for a multi-billion or especially big corporate, because multi-billion could also happen from a start or scale up in terms of revenue. But in terms of size, it is extremely complicated to get that done now.
What are you most excited about, like around travel and rail in particular, for the next few years?
Well, everything really. Yeah, I think that we live in times which is a bit sad, I find, where walls are rather built up instead of torn down. And I grew up in a country with a wall divided, so did you. So I think it's quite unique that we had the reunification, that a wall was torn down. Otherwise, a lot of the discussion that we're having these days wouldn't happen. Attracting talent from Poland, which from my point of view is probably one of the most qualified people in Europe, if not the world at the moment, and all that kind of stuff. And it frightens me a bit, frighten is not the right word, because it's hard to frighten or to scare me, but it makes me a bit sad that we're thinking a lot about nationalization around the world. And I think that travel can actually help to overcome, that, because if people continue to travel and continue to get in contact with a lot of cultures around the world, prejudices will reduce and people will just realize they're all people, and most of them are good people. Yeah, even though we're talking a lot about bad people. But overall, I would say that probably 90% plus are good people, and I think travel can help. And in order to be able to do that, we need continue a lot of cooperations around the world. Make sure, once again, that we continue keeping standards, that it doesn't lead to everybody inventing their own standards, and that these, let's say, overall bodies who try to ensure that, like IATA, for the aviation industry, for example, continue to do that, and that nobody says, we're withdrawing from the financing. And tech will play an absolutely important role in all of that. That's really, really important. And like I said, rail has a complete renaissance, and you see that in China, you see that in Spain, you see that in so many other countries around the world, where it plays a really crucial role again for the economic success, like it was at times when rail was invented.
Yeah, for sure. And that's not going to slow down over the next years or so, right? I think combined rail and hotel trips or whatever, right? All of that is only getting started now, I think, right?
Absolutely.
So it's still the exception that sort of you can even book that sort of on any of the tour operators.
Yeah, absolutely. And everybody says we don't have money, and it might be the case, but wherever I go, all flights, all hotels, everything is completely booked out for the next 6 months. And so people do still want to travel. And maybe in a more complex and more, scary world, people even feel the need to get away sometimes from reality to just, to just think about something else. So, so it's really important. It's really important.
Yeah. And maybe now is sort of a better time than any other sort of to invest in particular in the EU with sort of like stronger winds blowing in our faces from the West, right?
Absolutely. And I think there will be some mergers, as you can see with Lufthansa, for example, with ITA and that kind of stuff. I think that makes a lot of sense. And we have 3 big airline groups. We have, with SNCF, DB, and others, really, really big transportation companies. They are doing much more than just rail, right? So I'm pretty positive about that. And I think one of the strengths of Europe was always when they were against the wall, they found a way, to build something up and to create something quite unique. But what I find sometimes unfortunate in Europe is that it always has to come to that. Instead of saying, look, we know this is going to happen, so let's anticipate it and turn that ship around before it's too late. No, we wait until it's almost too late, and then we start going quite quickly. And I hope this is going to happen. But like I said, I'm pretty positive that this is going to happen again. But we need to work together. We can't do that as Germans or as French. We need to do that all together. Yeah. That's absolutely crucial. Otherwise, it's going to be complicated, I guess. So.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's a good closing word as well, right? Like, let's work together in Europe sort of for a better future and for bringing people together sort of so we work against sort of regressive tendencies in societies and so on, right?
Absolutely. Let's wish for that. But like I said, I'm very positive.
Yeah, me too. Thanks, Daniel, for joining me today. It was great chatting.
My pleasure.